Chapter 18. The Ethnic Cleansing of Ukraine and Poland. The Jews were not the only people to be chased out of their hometowns in the aftermath of the war, nor were they the only ones to suffer violence from mobs, policemen, and armed militias. If the survivors of the Holocaust were correct to insist that they had been singled out during the war, this was no longer the case after the war was over. Jews were certainly mistreated, as I have shown, but after the liberation the true focus of nationalist violence now fell on other minorities. One need only compare the events at Kielce with what happened in other parts of Poland that same year. At the end of January 1946, soldiers from the Polish 34th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Stanislaw Pluto surrounded the village of Zawadzka Moroczowska, or Zawadzka Moroczewska in Ukrainian, near Sanok in southeast Poland. The village was inhabited entirely by ethnic Ukrainians, and it was their ethnicity that was the sole reason for the events that took place there. According to eyewitnesses, the arrival of the army heralded a massacre that was every bit as bloody as anything that had happened during the war. They came to the village at dawn. All the men began to run to the woods, and those who remained attempted to hide in the attics and cellars, but to no avail. The Polish soldiers were looking everywhere, so that not a single place was left unsearched. Whenever they captured a man, he was killed instantly. Where they could not find the man, they beat the women and children. My father was hidden in the attic, and the Poles ordered my mother to climb up the ladder to search for him. These orders were accompanied by severe rifle butt blows. When mother started to climb, the ladder suddenly broke, and she fell down, breaking her elbow. 5 Poles began to beat her again with rifle butts, and when she could not lift herself, they kicked her with their heavy boots. I ran to her with my 4-year-old daughter, and wanted to shield her, but the soldiers began to beat me and my child. I soon fell unconscious, and awoke to find my mother and child killed, and the entire village afire. When Ukrainian partisans arrived in the area the next day, they discovered a scene of utter devastation. Nothing but smoldering ruins and a few moving shadows that looked more like ghosts than human beings. Apart from looting the village comprehensively and stealing most of the livestock, Polish soldiers had killed dozens of the villagers, most of them women and children. Worse than the fact of their murders was the manner in which they were committed. Many were beaten to death, disemboweled, or set on fire. Some women had their breasts sliced off, while others had their eyes gouged out or their noses and tongues removed. According to one of the Polish soldiers who took part in the massacre, there were some among us who were enjoying this butchery. Most of the historical sources for this massacre come from the Ukrainian side, which had a vested interest in portraying Polish brutality. But even allowing for a certain degree of embellishment, it was an undeniably horrific event. Neither did it end there. 2 months later, the army returned to Zawadzka Moroczowska and instructed all the surviving inhabitants of the village to gather their things and cross the border into Soviet Ukraine. All the remaining buildings, apart from the school and the church, were torched, and, as a warning of what awaited the villagers if they stayed, a group of 11 men were shot. Finally, in April, after several more villagers had been killed, the church and the school were also destroyed, and the entire population was rounded up and forcibly expelled from the country. During the course of these operations, some 56 people had been murdered, and many others horribly wounded. The village was all but wiped from the map. The difference between the massacres at Zawadzka Moroczowska and the pogrom in Kielce is that the former were carried out by the army rather than by an unruly mob. The harassment and murder of Jews in Poland was a popular phenomenon inspired by widespread anti-Semitism. It was a consequence not of government action, but of government inaction. Anti-Semites felt free to attack Jews because they were confident that they would not be punished for doing so. In the event, several of the perpetrators of the Kielce pogrom were tried and even executed for their crimes. The massacre of Ukrainian speakers at Zawadzka Moroczowska, by contrast, followed on directly from official government policy. The army had been sent to southeast Poland specifically to get rid of the Ukrainian population there. Unlike the Jews, who were merely encouraged to flee, Ukrainians were deliberately chased out, and when they refused to go, were killed or forcibly removed. If, as at Zawodka Morochowska, the army was somewhat overzealous in its actions, it was not, generally speaking, sanctioned for them. The most important thing, from the government's point of view, was that they were successful. Zawodka Morochowska was just one event in thousands. The persecution and expulsion of ethnic minorities occurred throughout Europe, especially in central and eastern parts of the continent. But events in Poland were particularly important, partly because this was the country where the most comprehensive ethnic cleansing took place, but also because the Polish-Ukrainian problem had such huge consequences for the rest of Europe. It was the nationalist tensions unleashed here that finally brought the Soviets round to the idea of harnessing nationalism for their own ends, not only in Poland, but in the whole of the Eastern Bloc. And it was the mutual expulsion of Poles and Ukrainians that would provide the template for ethnic cleansing throughout the continent. However, before one can truly understand events in villages like Zawodka Morochowska, it is necessary to go right back to the beginning. As many historians have pointed out, the ethnic cleansing of Poland did not occur in isolation, but in the aftermath of the greatest war of all time. Poles did not remove Ukrainians simply for the sake of it. It was only the huge events of the war that made such a radical move either desirable or possible. The origins of Polish-Ukrainian ethnic violence. The borderlands of eastern Poland were invaded not once, but 3 times during the war. First by the Soviets, then by the Nazis, and finally by the Soviets again. The different ethnic communities that lived in this richly diverse area reacted to each invasion in different ways. Most of the Polish population resisted the Nazis and Soviets alike, in the hope that Poland might somehow be able to return to its pre-war status quo. The Ukrainian population, by contrast, was more divided. Almost all of them feared and hated the Russians because of the brutal way that they had ruled the Soviet part of Ukraine during the 1930s, but many welcomed the Germans, at least at first, as liberators. The Jews, meanwhile, did not know where to place their faith. Many hoped that the Soviet invasion might deliver them from Polish and Ukrainian anti-Semitism. Later, some seemed to hope that the German invasion would save them from Soviet persecution. By the time the region was invaded for a 3rd time, at the end of 1943, the handful of Jews who still survived had lost faith in all outsiders, whatever their nationality. Both the Soviets and the Nazis played these different ethnic groups off against one another. The Nazis especially sought to harness the nationalist sentiments of the Ukrainians in order to suppress the rest of the population. Even before the invasion, they had made contacts with Ukrainian far-right political groups, particularly the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN. This was an illegal, ultranationalist movement, akin to the Ustašas in Croatia or the Iron Guard in Romania, which embraced the use of violence to achieve its aims. The Nazis dangled the promise of Ukrainian independence before them in return for their collaboration. While the most powerful factions of this shady organization never trusted German intentions, other factions enthusiastically allowed themselves to be exploited, partly because they thought the Nazis would give them what they wanted, but also because they shared some of the Nazis' darker intentions. The most shameful collaboration between the OUN and the Nazis was the way in which they worked together to eradicate the Jews. The OUN had for years been speaking of ethnic purity, of a Ukraine for Ukrainians, and of the benefits of revolutionary terror. The implementation of the final solution, particularly in the region of Volhynia, showed followers of the OUN that the slogans were not mere rhetoric. These massacres, which occurred in full view of the general population, would provide the template for all future ethnic cleansing in the region. What once would have been unthinkable now became eminently possible. During the course of 1941 and 1942, about 12,000 Ukrainian policemen became intimately acquainted with the tactics the Nazis used to kill over 200,000 Volhynian Jews. As collaborators, they were involved in the planning of operations. They gave assurances to local populations in order to lull them into a false sense of security. They were employed in the sudden encirclement of Jewish villages and settlements, and even took part in some of the killing itself. The slaughter of the Jews was the perfect apprenticeship for what would come later. At the end of 1942, when it first became obvious that German power was waning, the same Ukrainian policemen deserted their posts en masse. They took their weapons and went to join the OUN's new armed partisan group, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, Ukrainska Povstanska Armia, or UPA. They used the skills they had learned under the Nazis to continue their campaign against their ethnic enemies, not only the region's few remaining Jews, but this time also its large Polish population. The massacre of Poles began in the same areas where Ukrainian policemen had been most intimately connected to the massacre of Jews, Volhynia. There were many reasons why the ethnic cleansing began here. The area contained extensive forests and marshes, and so was particularly suited to partisan activity, and the isolated Polish communities were much less well defended than in other areas. But the previous actions against the Jews certainly played their part. The taboos had already been broken. Young Ukrainian men here had become both trained to kill and inured to mass killing. When they embarked on their cleansing of the region at the end of 1942, they were, therefore, relatively free of both external and personal constraints. In the frenzied massacres that were to take place over the next few years, Polish communities were murdered in their entirety, from old men and women right down to newborn babies. The village of Oleksieta, for example, was torched during the Easter of 1943 in an operation deliberately designed to create terror amongst the Polish population. In Wyszocko-Wiesnie, 13 children were locked in a Catholic church, which was then set on fire. In Wola Ostrowiecka, the entire Polish community was rounded up in the local schoolyard. While the men were taken off, 5 at a time, to be hacked to death in a nearby barn, the women and children were driven into the school, which was blown up with hand grenades and then set on fire. In the village of Podkamien, a campaign of nighttime raids on remote farmsteads and outlying hamlets drove the villagers out of their homes. At first they took to sleeping in the fields in order to avoid surprise attacks, but eventually they sought sanctuary in the local monastery. On the 12th of March 1944, however, the monastery itself was besieged by UPA troops. Apart from a few people who managed to escape by jumping out of windows, the entire community, including the monks, was slaughtered. Their bodies were hung by the legs around the monastery as a warning to the rest of the Polish community of what lay in store for them if they stayed in the region. These are just a handful of examples that must stand for the hundreds of Polish villages affected by ethnic violence in 1943 and 1944. According to not only Polish sources, but German and Soviet ones, Ukrainian partisans indulged in beheading, crucifying, dismembering and disemboweling their victims, and often displayed bodies in a conscious attempt to strike terror into the remaining Polish community. They burned homes and churches, razed villages, and looted whatever they could lay their hands on. This took place throughout eastern Poland, western Ukraine. Any Ukrainians who attempted to shelter their Polish neighbors were also killed. Even UPA reports themselves confirmed that they set out to exterminate Poles as thoroughly as the Jews had already been exterminated, and in many areas succeeded. One of UPA's commanders-in-chief, Dmytro Kliaczewski, advised his commanders to liquidate the entire male Polish population between 16 and 60 years, and ordered that villages in the forests and villages adjacent to forests should be razed to the ground. The local commander of the Zawichost region, Yuri Stelmaszczuk, admitted that he had been given an order for the total physical extermination of the Polish population in all western provinces of Ukraine. Fulfilling this order of the OUN leaders, a formation consisting of several UPA bands slaughtered more than 15,000 Poles in August 1943. In reaction to such events, some local Poles began to set up their own militias for the purpose of self-defense. The Polish underground also diverted resources away from resisting the occupation in order to protect Polish communities from the UPA. Some Volhynian Poles turned to the Germans for jobs as policemen, so that they might have opportunities for revenge. The Germans certainly appeared happy to recruit them, and a new wave of collaboration was born, ironically in the name of controlling former collaborators who were now running amok. When the Soviets arrived in 1944, many Poles joined the Red Army or the NKVD, again with the purpose of exacting revenge for all they had suffered. Ukrainian villages were burned, and thousands of Ukrainian peasants killed, in both official and unofficial reprisals for the actions of UPA. These reprisals, naturally, were used by Ukrainian partisans as further justification for their targeting of Poles and Polish villages, and so the situation degenerated into a vicious cycle. During the final year of the war, and in its immediate aftermath, the entire region was engulfed in what was effectively a civil war. What began in Volhynia spread to Galicia and central Poland. Poles and Ukrainians slaughtered one another and burned each other's villages with an enthusiasm that far exceeded any of their actions against the German or Soviet occupiers. Waldemar Lutnik, a Polish partisan at the time, put this conflict in stark terms. They had killed 7 men 2 nights previously. That night, we killed 16 of theirs. A week later, the Ukrainians responded by wiping out an entire Polish colony, setting fire to the houses, killing those inhabitants unable to flee, and raping the women who fell into their hands. We retaliated by attacking an even bigger Ukrainian village, and this time 2 or 3 men in our unit killed women and children. The Ukrainians in turn took their revenge by destroying a village of 500 Poles, and torturing and killing all who fell into their hands. We responded by destroying 2 of their larger villages. This was how the fighting escalated. Each time more people were killed, more houses burnt, more women raped. Men become desensitized very quickly and kill as if they know nothing else. It is in this context that we must see the massacre at Zawodka Morochowska that I described at the beginning of this chapter. When viewed in isolation, it would be easy to come to the conclusion that it was a cold-blooded, purely Polish crime, committed in the name of ethnic cleansing. When one widens the time frame slightly, and discovers that the units involved in the massacre had suffered casualties during an attack by UPA partisans only the day before, it no longer seems quite so cold-blooded. And when one widens the time frame still further, and discovers that some of those involved in the massacre were veterans of the civil war between Poles and Ukrainians in Volhynia, revenge begins to look like a much stronger motive. This context in no way justifies what occurred at Zawodka Morochowska, or indeed the attacks on any of the other Ukrainian villages in southeast Poland in 1946, but it does go part of the way toward explaining it. Even the most conservative estimates suggest that around 50,000 Polish civilians were killed by Ukrainian partisans in Volhynia, and a further 20,000 to 30,000 in Galicia. In total, it is thought that up to 90,000 Poles were killed throughout the borderland areas during the civil conflict. Ukrainian deaths also number in the thousands, but since the Poles did not enter the conflict with an explicit plan to commit genocide, the Ukrainian faction lost far fewer people than they killed. Perhaps 20,000 in all. As with so many other areas of wartime European history, these numbers are controversial and subject to an ongoing argument between Polish and Ukrainian historians over who owns the rights to victimhood. In one sense, the absolute numbers do not really matter. It is enough to register that a violent civil war took place and that thousands died on both sides. But in another sense, the numbers are desperately important, especially in a climate where nationalism is on the rise once more across Europe. Ukrainians, naturally, are reluctant to admit to the role of the OUN and UPA in starting the cycle of violence, and in their attempts to minimize the numbers of Polish dead, occasionally distort the figures. Some Poles, on the other hand, wield statistics like a weapon in a historiographic rerun of the Civil War itself. In such a highly charged atmosphere, it is unlikely that any agreement over figures will be reached. The ones I have just given are the most impartial estimates available. The Soviet solution. When the Soviets re-invaded Ukraine and Poland in 1944, and discovered the extent of the ethnic conflict there, they were alarmed. They certainly could not allow such chaos to disrupt their supply lines while the war was still going on, and since the UPA had also begun to attack Soviet formations, something had to be done to stabilize the situation. Their solution was simple. If the different nationalities could not be made to live together peacefully on the same territory, then they should be separated. The separation was to be done on a statewide scale. The Poles should live in Poland, and the Ukrainians should live in a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The demarcation line between the two would not be the old Polish border from the 1930s. It would be moved westwards, so that most of what Ukrainians regarded as Western Ukraine would be reunited with Eastern Ukraine. This would not only extend Soviet territory, but would steal the thunder of the OUN-UPA by giving Ukrainians the very thing they had been fighting for. Any Poles living on the wrong side of this border would be expelled into Poland, and likewise, Ukrainians on the other side of the border would be repatriated. To say this was a controversial solution at the time would be a gross understatement. For the Polish government in exile in London, the idea of changing the Ukrainian-Polish border so far westwards was virtually unthinkable. The border that the Soviets proposed was the so-called Curzon Line, which would see an area the combined size of all three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, severed from eastern Poland. The Polish city of Lvov would be awarded to Ukraine, Brest-Litovsk given to Belarus, and Vilno, modern-day Vilnius, handed over to Lithuania. To agree to such a border would be effectively to endorse the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. On the face of it, the Western Allies were also opposed to such a solution. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had previously expressed outrage at any suggestion that the Soviets should be allowed to hold on to this territory. And yet both politicians were realists and knew that it would be virtually impossible to oppose Soviet plans, now that they already occupied the whole region. The price of challenging Stalin over the issue was not one that either premier was willing to contemplate. "Do you want me to go to war with Russia?" said Roosevelt sharply, when his ambassador to Poland suggested that America should stand firm on the subject. As early as November 1943, when Churchill and Roosevelt met Stalin for the first time at Tehran, they both indicated to him that they would not oppose his plans to incorporate the eastern borderlands of Poland into the Soviet Union. Churchill made no secret of this, and tried soon after to convince the Polish Prime Minister, Stanislaw Mikolajczyk, to accept this as a fait accompli, something that Mikolajczyk steadfastly refused to do. Roosevelt was more calculating, however, and did not make his position clear until after he was re-elected the following year, because he was relying on the support of millions of Polish-American voters. The final blow to Polish hopes on the subject came at the next meeting of the Big Three at Yalta in February 1945, when they jointly and formally declared that the eastern frontier of Poland should follow the Curzon Line. The tragic thing about this process is that it was pushed through without any reference to the wishes of the Polish people themselves. Not even their elected representatives were consulted until after the deal had been struck in Tehran. For Poles the world over, this was nothing short of an Anglo-American betrayal. When Churchill and Roosevelt had signed the Atlantic Charter in 1941, they had promised never to endorse any territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned. By agreeing to Soviet demands at Tehran and Yalta, they had explicitly broken that promise. There were many within the British and American establishment who shared these feelings. Arthur Bliss Lane, the U.S. ambassador to Poland, openly called it a capitulation to Stalin, a policy of appeasement that was similar to the appeasement of Hitler before the war, and a betrayal of America's Polish allies. In Britain, the Labour MP John Rhys Davies stated bitterly in the House of Commons, "We started this war with great motives and high ideals. We published the Atlantic Charter and then spat on it, stomped on it and burnt it, as it were, at the stake, and now nothing is left of it." Forced repatriation. Very little thought was given at Yalta to just what this change of borders would mean for the population of the region, It was regarded as Stalin's own business, and not something that the Western Allies could realistically influence. In fact, the Soviets had already started to arrest and deport people according to their usual methods almost as soon as they had arrived in the area. But Stalin remained cautious, and the wholesale deportation of Poles did not begin in earnest until the Yalta Agreement was signed. This was something quite new as far as the Soviets were concerned. The Soviets were well acquainted with deporting whole populations from one region to another for reasons of nationality. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, entire communities in the Soviet Union had been moved like pieces on a chessboard. The most recent such move had been the deportation of the Tatars from the Crimea, which at the time was not a part of Ukraine, in May 1944. However, until now, such deportations had always been carried out for political or military, rather than purely ethnic reasons. Moreover, they had only ever been conducted within Soviet territory. The Soviets had never before expelled an ethnic minority from their territory into another country. The population exchange that was to take place between Ukraine and Poland, therefore, reflected a marked change in Soviet policy. Between 1944 and 1946, some 782,582 Poles were removed from Soviet Ukraine and resettled in Poland. A further 231,152 were expelled from Belarus, and 169,244 from Lithuania, giving a total of almost 1.2 million. Many of these people were harassed into leaving by the authorities, but many were also encouraged to leave of their own accord in order to escape the continuing ethnic violence which raged throughout 1945 and even into 1946. In a peculiar way, the Soviets and the UPA seemed to be working in tandem to achieve their common goal. Maria Yosifovska and her family, for example, were forced out of their home village of Chervonograd when the UPA burned it down in July 1945. Immediately after the attack, the Soviet authorities laid on a special train to transport them out of Ukraine to Yaroslav in Polish Galicia, almost as if the opportunity were too good to miss. With the blessing of the Soviets, the Poles replied in kind by repatriating over 482,000 Ukrainians, mostly from Galicia in the southeast of the country. The massacre at Zawadzka Moroczowska was part of this process and shows how brutally it was carried out. Once again, the official actions of the Polish government were accompanied by unofficial actions by nationalist groups and members of the underground Armia Krajowa, Home Army. Atrocities were carried out on innocent civilians, and even people who did not consider themselves Ukrainian at all. The Lemkos, for example, were an ethnic group belonging to the Beskidi ranges of the Carpathian Mountains, who had no historical interest in Ukraine or any other kind of nationalism, and wanted only to keep their own lands intact. Yet they were targeted and deported along with other Ukrainian speakers. Attempts by local leaders to explain the difference between Ukrainians and Lemkos fell on deaf ears. Unsurprisingly, some Ukrainians and Lemkos turned to the UPA for protection against deportation. The UPA in Polish Galicia was not nearly so indiscriminately brutal as it was across the border in Ukraine, but was still not above murder, torture, and the mutilation of its enemies. One former Polish soldier from this time, Henryk Jan Mielcarek, writes passionately about fellow soldiers who were beaten to death by UPA partisans, had their eyes and tongues cut out, or were tied to trees and left to die. But, given that nobody else was willing to help them, many Ukrainians saw no alternative to joining such partisan groups, or at least to providing them with support. This increasing popularity of the UPA in Galicia only inflamed the situation. It gave the army and the authorities even more justification for their policy of expelling these communities. The Polish repatriation campaign in 1945-46, brutal as it was, ended up being fairly successful. It did, however, encounter a major problem. Towards the end of 1945, some of those Ukrainians who had already left Poland voluntarily started to come back. Many of these people had discovered that life in Ukraine was far worse than it was in the areas they had left, even factoring in Polish harassment. Not only was Ukraine much less well developed than southeast Poland, but the way it had repeatedly changed hands during the war had left it desolate. To make things even worse, the Soviets were not allowing many Polish Ukrainians to settle in the very country they were supposed to be returning to. In order to prevent the OUN-UPA problem escalating, more than 75% of Polish Ukrainians were settled in other parts of the USSR. As a consequence, thousands of Ukrainians returned to Poland in 1945 and 1946 to warn their fellow villagers not to go. This goes part of the way towards explaining why so many Ukrainians resisted deportation, even in the face of increasingly violent racist attacks against them. At the end of 1946, time finally ran out for the Polish authorities, who wished to expel Ukrainian speakers from the country in their entirety. To bring the repatriations to an end, the Soviets closed the border between Ukraine and Poland. This did not suit the Polish authorities at all, since they estimated that there were still some 74,000 Ukrainians in the country who had evaded repatriation. In fact, the numbers were much higher, about 200,000 in total. The Polish government petitioned the Soviets to allow the process to continue a little while longer, but to no avail. Given the impossibility of expelling any more Ukrainians, it is conceivable that the matter might have ended there. Perhaps if the terrorist activities of the UPA had stopped, the Polish government would have felt confident enough to leave the remaining Ukrainians and Lemkos alone. Plans to continue the displacements on an internal basis, which already existed at the beginning of 1947, might have been dropped, and centuries of Ukrainian culture in Galicia might have been allowed to remain. Perhaps. Such speculation is moot, however, because tensions between the Poles and their Ukrainian-speaking minorities did not relax. Indeed, they escalated. The tipping point came on the 28th of March 1947, when the Polish Deputy Minister of Defense, General Karol Swerczewski, was assassinated by the UPA. This killing proved to be a disaster for Poland's Ukrainians, and was used as justification for a whole range of repressive measures against them. The following day, Polish officers began to speak openly of the complete extermination of the remnants of the Ukrainian population in the southeastern border region of Poland. The Polish administration immediately launched another sweep of the region to root out all the remaining Ukrainian speakers. The operation was to be called Akcja Wisla, Operation Vistula. Its objectives were not only to destroy the UPA in Poland, but to bring about what its architects called, rather chillingly, a final solution to the Ukrainian problem. Forced assimilation. Operation Vistula began at the end of April 1947 and continued through to the late summer. Its intention was not only to destroy the UPA bands, but to work with the State Office of Repatriation to conduct an evacuation of all persons of Ukrainian nationality from the region to the northwestern territories, resettling them there with a dispersion as sparse as possible. Historians who claim that the only purpose of the operation was to remove support for the UPA are ignoring these clear statements, issued by the Office of State Security itself, declaring ethnic cleansing of the country as an overt and separate objective. The operation was intended to root out all the remaining Ukrainian speakers in the country to the last man, woman, and child, and was to include even mixed Polish-Ukrainian families. These people were to be given a few hours to pack their things, and then taken to transit hubs to be registered. From here they were to be transported to diverse locations throughout the areas in the west and north that had once been German, but which were now part of Polish territory. In theory, families were to be transported together, but in practice all deportees were given a number and were displaced along with those who registered at the same time. In this way, family members who registered separately were often sent to towns and villages miles apart, unless they could convince or bribe officials to let them stay together. Families were also supposed to be allowed to take clothes and valuables with them, and even a certain amount of livestock, in order to sustain themselves in their new homes. In reality, they were rarely given enough time to pack properly, and were often forced to abandon important items at home to be looted by their Polish neighbors. Many also complain of being robbed by unscrupulous guards or gangs of local people during their journey. There was nothing especially unique about the rounding up of entire villages and their displacement to another part of the continent. The war had made this practice commonplace, and by 1947 the specific displacement of Ukrainians had already been going on for more than 2 years. Nor was the scale of it unique. Indeed, it was a relatively minor event compared to the continent-wide expulsion of Germans that I shall describe in the next chapter. What made this particular displacement different from all the others was its purpose. The Polish authorities did not merely want to eject this ethnic group, but to compel it to give up all claims to a separate nationality. They were to be forced to change the way they spoke, the way they dressed, the way they worshipped, and the way they were educated. The authorities would no longer allow them to be Ukrainians or Lemkos, because they wanted us all to become Poles. The whole process was deeply distressing, as interviews with Ukrainian-speaking Poles in recent times clearly show. For Anna Klimash and Rosalia Naduch, Lemkos who were deported from their village of Bednarka in Galicia, the most distressing event was the expulsion itself, and especially the behavior of their Polish neighbors. Far from supporting or helping them, local Poles seemed only too keen to be rid of them, and looted their homes and property enthusiastically even before they had left. Fellow villagers who refused to allow looters into their homes were beaten, while others had to stand by and watch while their houses were ransacked before their eyes. Some even had things stolen from the carts they were loading up to take with them, with the words, "Don't take this, don't take that, you won't need this any longer." For others, the most stressful time was the period of uncertainty that came after they had left their villages and were forced to wait in shabby transit camps to see where they would be displaced to. This period could last anything from a few days to several weeks. Olga Zdanovich, a Ukrainian from Gradziowa in Galicia, had to sleep in the open at the transit camp in Trustyanik for 3 weeks. The villagers from Bednarka were forced to stay in a camp at Zagorzany for 2 weeks, also without shelter, and with little food to eat but that which they had brought with them. Rosalia Najduch was reduced to stealing fodder from local peasants to feed her animals. Anna Szczewczyk and Mykolai Sokach remember sleeping underneath their carts alongside the livestock as the only way of escaping the elements. During this time, all deportees were questioned by Polish officials, the implication being that their very ethnicity made them potential UPA terrorists. It was at the transit camps that those who were most suspected of partisan involvement were arrested. For these people, the stress of displacement now became a nightmare. They were sent to prisons and internment camps, the most infamous of which was Jaworzno, an ex-Nazi prison camp that had been taken over by the Polish authorities. Here they were beaten, robbed, and subjected to a regimen of poor food, poor sanitation, and poor treatment. One of the several commandants of the camp was the infamous Salomon Murel, who was transferred here after his time in charge of the camp for Germans at Zgoda. As at Zgoda, prisoners were tortured by sadistic prison guards, who hung them from pipes, pierced them with pins, force-fed them various liquids, and beat them with metal bars, electric cables, rifle butts, and a variety of other implements. In the Ukrainian sub-camp at Jaworzno, 161 prisoners died as a direct result of malnutrition, 5 from typhus, and 2 women committed suicide. For the majority of Ukrainians, meanwhile, the next stage was their journey to their new homes. Friends and acquaintances were split up and loaded onto trains along with their livestock, 4 families and their animals to each boxcar, and transported to the former German provinces of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, on the opposite side of Poland. While the journey was nothing like as terrifying as the ordeal awaiting those who were sent to Jaworzno, there was a brief moment of panic when the trains passed within a few kilometers of Auschwitz. The journey could take anything up to 2 weeks, during which time the deportees became filthy and covered in lice. For all the uncertainty and discomfort of the journey, it was sometimes not nearly so unpleasant as their arrival in a new and unknown land. The way the system was supposed to work was as follows. Each family would be given a destination, and would be expected to report to the local state office of repatriation when they got there. They would be allocated a property to live in, or sometimes they would be awarded this property in a lottery. Having been abandoned by their former German owners, these properties were supposed to be furnished. The idea was that the furniture that the displaced Ukrainians and Lemkos had had to leave behind would be replaced by furniture in their new homes. In reality, however, anything of use or value had long since been looted or confiscated by corrupt officials. By 1947, all the best properties had been taken by displaced Poles, leaving only derelict buildings, ransacked apartments, or broken-down farms with desperately poor soil. Families who arrived here often abandoned the places they had been allocated and roamed the countryside looking for something better. Their welcome was usually far from warm. Since the purpose of removing these people from their communities was to disperse them, families from the same village were not supposed to be housed in the same area. Indeed, often only nuclear families were allowed to stay together. Extended families were to be split up in the same way as the whole community was. In most cases, therefore, families found themselves completely isolated, without any of the community they had grown up with to support them. Worse than this, they regularly found themselves surrounded by hostile people who actively despised them. Many of the Poles who had recently been deported from Volhynia and other parts of Soviet Ukraine had also been relocated in these areas. Having survived the savage civil war in their own homelands, the last people these Poles wanted as neighbors were more Ukrainians. Some of those deported in Operation Vistula speak of being beaten by Poles in the towns where they were rehoused. Others were merely shunned. Almost all found it difficult to find work or make friends. Anti-Ukrainian prejudice was everywhere. Mykolai Sokach remembers being arrested and beaten by militiamen who were convinced that he was a member of the UPA. He had no choice but to take it in his stride, for, as he explains, Lemkos were beaten a lot. Those who were sent to Yavorno remember having stones thrown at them and being spat at by local people because they were supposedly the ones responsible for the assassination of General Swierczewski. Theodor Szczewczyk remembers overhearing a Polish smallholder he worked for claiming, "I won't pay those fucking Ukrainians. They can work for food," and so on. Where Ukrainians and Lemkos did come across others like them, opportunities for mutual support, or even basic socializing, were rare. Official paranoia about the UPA had led to rules banning Ukrainian speakers from gathering in groups of more than a few people. Anyone caught speaking Ukrainian to someone else was automatically suspected of conspiracy. The Orthodox and Uniate churches were also banned, obliging Ukrainians to worship in a foreign tongue, in Catholic churches, or not at all. Since the point of Operation Vistula was to assimilate Ukrainians into the Polish communist state, children were in some ways the main focus of the authorities' attentions. All children were forced to speak Polish at school, and Ukrainian literature was banned. Boys and girls caught speaking Ukrainian were reprimanded, and sometimes punished. They were often given compulsory classes in Catholicism, as well as the usual Stalinist communist indoctrination that was a part of every child's education. Anything that revealed an alternative identity to the official Polish one was forbidden. And yet, for all this, assimilation was impossible, because their classmates often would not let them forget that they were not Polish. Children laughed at their accents, taunted them, and sometimes physically bullied them. Ukrainian children were not invited to Polish children's houses. Their difference from their classmates, and their isolation from any other children like themselves, made their situation quite similar to that of the German children in Scandinavia. While there do not yet appear to have been studies into the life chances of these children compared with others, as there have been in Norway, it would be reasonable to assume that they probably suffered similarly high rates of anxiety, stress, and depression in later life. Even more than the children of Germans in Norway, today many Ukrainians once again openly speak of themselves as a distinct group in Polish society, something that would have been unthinkable in the early 1950s. The one experience that united all these people, and indeed all of the millions of others who were displaced from their lands after the Second World War, was a desire to return home. This was, however, the one act that was forbidden above all others. Those who tried to return to their villages in Galicia found themselves faced with angry militiamen and were threatened with violence or imprisonment. For others, there was simply no point. In the absence of the communities they had grown up with, their villages were no longer the idealized places they remember. When Olga Zdanowicz tried to visit Graciowa many years later, she found nothing there. The village had been burnt. It didn't exist anymore. The ethnic cleansing of Poland in 1947 is not something that can be considered in isolation. It was a product of many years of civil war and more than 7 years of racial violence that had begun almost as soon as the Germans had invaded the west of the country in 1939. It saw its foundation in the Holocaust of Polish Jews, particularly in the massacres in Volhynia, and the collaboration of Ukrainian nationalists in these and subsequent atrocities. After the war, the expulsion of Poland's ethnic minorities was carried out with the explicit help of the Soviet Union, but the subsequent displacement and assimilation of Ukrainians and Lemkos was something that Poles conducted on their own initiative. Operation Vistula was effectively the final act in a racial war begun by Hitler, continued by Stalin, and completed by the Polish authorities. By the end of 1947, there were barely any ethnic minorities left in Poland. Ironically, given that Ukrainians had been responsible for much of the initial impetus, the country was far more ethnically homogeneous than its neighbor. The Ukraine for Ukrainians, espoused by the OUN, was never achieved, particularly in the eastern parts of the Republic, which kept a large Polish and Jewish minority, even while Western Ukraine was busy exchanging populations with Poland. Poland for the Polish, by contrast, was by the end of the 1940s not merely an aspiration, but a fact. This process, which destroyed centuries of cultural diversity in just a few short years, was accomplished in 5 stages. The first was the Holocaust of the Jews, brought about by the Nazis but facilitated by Polish anti-Semitism. The second was the harassment of Poland's returning Jews, which, as I discussed in the last chapter, caused them to flee not only Poland, but Europe as a whole. The third and fourth were the ejection of Ukrainians and Lemkos in 1944–46, and their assimilation during Operation Vistula in 1947. The final piece of the ethnic jigsaw in Poland, and one that I have not yet touched on, was the expulsion of the Germans. This, along with similar actions across the whole of Europe by other countries, is the subject of the next chapter.